What do we need to fight climate change? Education, actions now, law, CO2 price, power to the people. And the more often one statement is made, the larger the key is here. I always like these word bubbles when they like starting to form. Awareness, participation, equality. So I think this is something which should guide us through the next days, that we see, okay, it's quite interesting. We ask this question a lot at different occasions. And if it's a more technical conference, I would find here something like solar PV or e-vehicles or hydrogen or blockchain if they very fancy. And here we see already the direction of our discussion. So solidarity, participation, awareness, equality is definitely a different angle we look at these things. So very curious on the presentations from Dan and Rebecca to see that how your views are on this, what is needed to fight climate change.
For me, the most exciting change is not what's happened in solar or in flow batteries or in offshore wind or any piece of hardware. They're all important. But for me, the really exciting thing is to recognize that climate protection is now being understood more and more as a social opportunity. And I think that's really the key lesson. And really the picture that I think everyone who's attending this knows in some form is this very scary graph produced by Cristina Figueres when she was head of the climate negotiations. And it really just speaks to the fact that while we're all worried about what our greenhouse gas emissions are, I'm worried more about the slope of the line than I am about the peak, because we've had some good actions. Germany with their energy transition, China, their recent announcements, California, Bangladesh, some good things have happened individually, but we need good things in large numbers every year now going for the next decades. And if I just look at the kind of smoother curve, the blue, if we'd started in 2016 when we should have had in the United States President Clinton, not the mistake we chose, we would have only needed to improve by 3% a year for every year. But we, of course, didn't do that, so we've delayed it, so we have to have a steeper and steeper slope. Well, blue is 3%, orange is 4%, red is 5%. So if we look back at our global history, going back to the 1980s, how quickly were we decarbonizing back then? About 1% a year. Between 2010 and 2020, it ramped up, it peaked at just under 3%. And then in these dark days of Trump and Bolsonaro and things, we've seen it come back down to where it was 30 years ago, which is not acceptable. Even this peak year is not enough. We need to be over 3% and maintain. So we need to be innovative, creative, and consistent. And that's why what's happened with clean energy is such a great start, but it's only a tool. It doesn't solve anything. And the famous learning curve for solar showing year after year, solar's gotten cheaper as we've installed more and more. That's great. We need that. Solar is now least cost in many parts of the world. It's not just true for solar. It's also true for wind. And one that doesn't get enough attention is that it's also true for energy storage. This is the same set of curves for different batteries, for lithium-ion batteries in your phone, for flow batteries, a new emerging technology, nickel metal hydride, lots of wonderful technology, material science. It's all important. It's all a necessary but not sufficient start.
Given that more than 32% of the continent's gross domestic product is coming from agriculture, given that food systems account for over 65% of the continent's labor force, and that food demand is quickly on the rise, many African governments have highlighted agriculture's major potential to deliver both economic and food security gains, as well as to create jobs. But according to the ILO, the agriculture sector is actually challenged to absorb large volumes of new workers, given its low productivity and low profitability. If you look at yields from maize, for instance, which is the continent's most important crop, it's averaging about 2 tons per hectare per year. That's less than a quarter of yields in the Americas. And over the past 30 years, productivity per person has increased at only a fraction of the rates in the Americas and Asia. And according to the FAO, this is because growth in the region, growth in sub-Saharan Africa, has accrued predominantly from area expansion and intensification of cropping systems, as opposed to targeted widespread improvement in productivity. So to today, to 2020, smallholder farmers are producing more than 85% of this entire continent's agricultural output. And more than 75% of those small farmers are preparing lands using hand tools only, and only 5% of total cultivated land is under irrigation. This is all compounded by what we've talked about before, Africa's growing population. And in fact, we're expected to have about 53% more people in 2050 than in 2015. And this is increasing the scarcity and the price of land. It's exacerbating challenges of climate change, soil depletion, land ownership, shrinking the medium arable farm size. And that's to say nothing of, the locust swarms, the flooding that we're seeing today in parts of Kenya, Ethiopia, and Rwanda with this past rainy season. So all of that is showing that basically agriculture continues to be a major opportunity, but there are some barriers to be addressed. Another campaign that we have is called Powering Agriculture, to basically strengthen the linkages between those two sectors that we've been talking about so much today. So, there's already early indications that not just climate change, but now COVID is beginning to affect some of the key staple and cash crop value chains across the region. So this campaign really allows us basically to work with a series of, or a coalition rather, of players to catalyze and accelerate collaboration. Our goal is to basically bring data into the space and use geospatial and analytical tools to map out and size the market potential of energy access interventions for selected agricultural value chains. If you skip down to the next slide, you'll see just a quick image of what that's looking like. So you can see on the left and on the right, we've got this is the map of Uganda where I was mentioning that we work. And you can see those circles, those squares that are highlighted in blue on the right-hand side here, you can see, yes, exactly those. You can see these are areas where, given where we're projected to see least cost electrification in this country over the course of the next 10 years, where mini grids and energy infrastructure like that can actually help to improve agro-productivity in areas where there currently is no access to milling or other agro-processing machinery. And then if you just skip down to the next slide and the next one after that, I want to say a little bit about a third campaign that we have running called Powering Jobs. And as I mentioned, all of this links back to jobs creation. And what we were trying to do here is really understand what is the workforce available and ready to support an evolution in the energy and agriculture sector? And if so, what are some of the challenges to unlocking that workforce potential? If you skip down to the next slide. So we basically did a survey across a range of energy technologies to look at both direct jobs, indirect jobs, and induced or stimulated rather job creation. And what we found is actually that, skip down to the next slide, the early data, just with 1 year's worth of data, we can see that the energy access space is actually becoming a major employer in emerging markets. We looked at Nigeria and we looked at Kenya, and we found that in both of these communities, as you can see from the graph, in both of these countries rather, the energy access sector is employing thousands of persons, both directly and informally. The interesting thing, though, is that more than 5-fold jobs are probably being created just through access to these types of technologies. So we're seeing lots of new activity, especially as I mentioned in the agro-processing space, everything from fruit drying to refrigeration, cold storage, milling, egg incubation, honey processing, and more. There's in fact over 100 firms developing off-grid solar productive use appliances just for the African market, and hundreds more distributing them. And this is important because women and youth are often the hardest impacted by a dearth of rural employment opportunities due to lack of education, traditional perceptions of gender roles, and so on. And this is actually these are the two demographics, women and youth, that we're seeing most employed through productive use, most employed through direct employment, through direct work with decentralized renewable energy companies. In terms of what kinds of jobs we're talking about, it's everything across these kinds of value chains that you're seeing here. So from electric engineers to programmers, technicians, downstream industries like e-waste recycling, upstream industries like manufacturing, finance, legal, and all of that to say that there's basically a lot of space for engagement in solutions building.
Many African countries have introduced legislation that fosters the greening of the energy mixes and aims at integrating modern clean energy into the national grid. While this is a very positive sign, not so much is known about the content and scope of said policies, and especially comparative perspectives are missing. So what we want to know is how just are how just are energy transitions in African countries? To what extent do their policies contribute to distributive energy justice, such as better access to renewable energy, both in urban and rural areas, procedural energy justice, like transparent and participative decision-making on energy projects, and also recognitional energy justice, which is maybe the most important dimension? Are the needs of vulnerable parts of society taken into account, for example, by social energy tariffs, by meeting the needs for heating and cooling, energy for lighting, or in total by combating energy poverty? This is why my team has carried out a comparative study, a mapping of renewable energy policies in 34 countries according to their scope and their contribution to greater energy justice. So this can give evidence how energy transitions are moving forward, what forms of good practice we can find, and how this may be related to better realizing SDG 7, reliable and universal access to modern clean energy. So what we did is we had a sample of 34 states, all those who have put in place substantial energy policies, and we coded the transformative quality of a certain policy, like it's only single issue direct policies, these integrative policies that focus, for example, on grid integration, or are we talking about enabling policies, which is more comprehensive frameworks, auction instruments, or feed-in tariffs that change the nature of the energy mix and of the energy regime in a wider scale? And second, we focused on energy justice in these three dimensions that I already mentioned: procedural, distributive, and recognitional energy justice. And in our work, we created an open source database to make sure that everyone can access the data and that all our research is open source available. So this is what we found. Looking at the transformative qualities, we saw that several countries have already introduced direct and integrative instruments. And we found more comprehensive policy frameworks in Egypt, Ethiopia, Mauritius, Rwanda, and South Africa. We saw a tendency to move towards market-oriented instruments such as auctions or de-risking instruments. And we, of course, saw heavy path dependencies still preventing a faster pace of energy transitions. And this is prevalent in South Africa, Nigeria, or Angola. And regarding the justice dimension, we saw that distributive justice was frequently addressed, for example, by focusing on rural development. We saw that procedural justice was only scarcely addressed, but South Africa was a good exception. And we found that Recognitional justice is addressed in several programs that, for example, focus on education and training or on energy poverty as a whole, and consider to what extent renewable energy has very strong cross-cutting abilities. So we were wondering, can we find certain correlations? How do the transformative qualities of a certain policy and the normative quality interact, and can we come to better conclusions with certain countries that may give some best practice example also to others following up on the pace of transition?
Of course, there's no climate justice without gender justice. So to start with, women are more likely to be poor and have less resources to deal with the changing climate. Their place in society and the gender roles that define it and are imposed on them increase women's vulnerabilities to impact. So, for example, poor women and children are 14 times more likely to be killed in a natural disaster than men. At the same time, we face unequal participation in decision-making processes and policy making. Yesterday, I found it very interesting in one of the sessions where we talked about how we deal with climate change from 3 different countries. We don't see a lot of women in leadership roles when it comes to policy making. And this is an issue because it makes climate-related or all related policy planning very one-sided, one-gendered, and leaves out a lot of gap and needs of half of the world's population. And at the same time, research and project experience shows that when women are involved, they can and they do play a critical role in response to climate change due to their inherent knowledge, for example, in some communities at the household or community level, or even when they take place in participation at the political level. This has led to greater responsiveness to the citizens' need and inclusion of more factors. And I think we place a lot of hope in achieving greater climate justice at the international negotiation rounds, notably the Conference of Parties. But this is an issue because the UNFCCC ties equity to common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And this is a very vague definition, leads to a lot of room for translation, and leading also to a huge tug of war between countries when it comes to commitment. But what we know is that there definitely needs to be greater recognition of the marginalized. Instead of only looking at mitigation and adaptation, we also need to remember that there was loss and compensation in the beginning. And we also have to remember that we have a moral responsibility to include the voice of future generations, because at the same time, we have a choice, kind of in this moment, more or less. The future generation will have no choice but to combat the effects of climate changes under with more restricted resources and with more urgent time frames. So I think that we touched on a lot of very challenging points, but this is good because when we look at the challenges, we do see the way forward. And this is the opposite. So solutions need to be inclusive, affordable, available, transparent. We need to hold fossil fuel companies and our leaders accountable. There needs to be more intra and intergenerational equity. And if these words sound familiar to you, it's because we saw a lot of them in the word cloud yesterday in the opening session. So we're already on the good path. We need to remember to include traditional knowledge along with modern science. There need to be a lot of community and eco-based system approaches, as we also saw in the sessions yesterday. We need to include all diverse and representative research groups for creative solution findings. And this is the only way that we can address all the current institutional, contextual, and empirical biases within the fields, within ourselves. And this needs
critical reflection. Yeah. So yeah, we invite you to stay strong, to support each other, to communicate in a careful and respectful manner, because language always matters. and then maybe from time to time step back and reflect with friends, fellow researchers, family, or whoever you want to reflect with, to overcome the biases we are actually facing and feeling. So we found these questions actually quite helpful for our own reflection as well, and we just want to briefly read them out loud. So who do we believe we are representing? So, and who are we speaking for? Who do we imagine ourselves fighting on behalf of? Is this a safe and just space? Who has the most to teach us and the least opportunities to do so? It's a very painful process to go into the reflection, but taking the roads less traveled is never easy. But we believe that we can do this together as a strong network and passionate people.
A rapidly reducing coal-based power generation and a global phase-out by 2040 is the single most important step to keep the door open for achieving the Paris Agreement. This shows us that the persistence of coal extraction constitutes a key obstacle to reach climate goals. In this setting, it is important to know that Colombia is the world's 5th largest coal exporter and has enough reserves to continue doing so for a very long time. First, we looked at it from the perspective of a so-called relational gender focus. This lens refers to an approach that explicitly acknowledges the role of patriarchy, understood as a system of imaginaries and practices thought from the masculine logics and that assigns according to sex and in a differential way to males and to human females, that is to men and women, certain identities and social roles in advantage for men, meaning for women, discrimination and many types of violence. So hence, we identify differentiated impacts that activities such as coal mining has had historical also on women, and we consider the role of new gender dynamics for just and truly sustainable transitions. Have taken root and the possibility of living with dignity is defended. This is not limited to space and its physical elements, including so-called natural resources. The territory integrates a set of cultural, historical, religious, spiritual, sociopolitical, and economic meanings that are constantly assigned and developed by the communities that inhabit it. So acknowledging this particular relationship is key to. Finally, the third lens was that of community sovereignty. Here we focus on 2 dimensions that are key: territoriality and collectivity. So we focus on communities that are in a territory, understanding the previous definition, and that live with a collective identity and history within it. So community sovereignty in this setting is a set of practices through which community decides and acts on its territory, and the first component of that territory is the individual bodies of those people. The prerequisites to do so are different basic resources, such as water, food, but also affection, education, discussion, cooperation. And the via in which community sovereignty materializes is with practices that lead to the development of physical and human capacities for its execution. So what are the preliminary results of our travel? We found out that discussing and talking about energy transitions, the communities are not interested in one homogenizing notion of one energy transition. We became aware that there are at least 3 levels at which communities have thought about what an energy transition can mean to them. First, what they call, or we came to call, a mining extractive transition aimed at the permanent and most timely cessation of large-scale coal mining in Cesar and La Guajira in order to protect the life of the communities and nature. In other words, closing the mines as soon as possible. The second dimension, a transition towards energy democratization aimed at fighting poverty and energy inequity, of which communities in the country's peripheries have been victims for a very long time. And the third dimension is a broad and comprehensive transition that transcends the energy field and seeks to close structural gaps and address historical injustice. What people often told us when we ask about energy transition was, what energy transition are you talking about if a woman is killed every 17 hours in this country? What energy transition if we do not have water, food, or housing, let alone solar panels or windmills? What energy transition if instead of coal, now our wind or our sun or our other subterranean reaches will be depredated? So the second insight that we got from the result is that gender constructions play a very central role in understanding and even changing power dynamics around coal extraction and energy transitions. So women and the territory have been historically constructed as objects of male appropriation and use. Hence, Francis Bacon's literal invitation to enslave nature as a feminine slave that can be understood as a link in a long chain of social construction, leaving profound cognitive scars in people and communities' minds. And this understanding that mining has been casted as a profoundly masculine, powerful, and imposing activity. So our research suggests that to doubt any that we should doubt any solution that does not actively and explicitly question these underlying constructions that are so profoundly embedded in our respective minds, both in the communities and outside. Finally, we found out that community already have their ideas, their heterotopias, and their resources. They do not seek guidance, imposition, or suggestions from outside. They know that their practices are different and that they are fitting their concrete context, and rather than imposition or help from outside, they search for eye-to-eye solidarity and partnership on their terms and with their priorities. This is an ongoing research, and there is plenty of insight still to collect, but I will finish on this moment to take more time from you.
Around 5 years ago, an indigenous village in Cambodia near the river were doing a series of rituals to appease their ancestors because they thought the reason for the flooding of their land was their lack of paying respect to their ancestors and to nature. Only to learn later that the large hydro dams in Vietnam in the upstream of the river was releasing water and causing the flooding of their lands. In Brazil, the customary forest protected by indigenous communities in the Amazon is being burned down by ranchers for expansion of their ranches. In Africa, the Maasai are in desperate situation because their cows and herd of animals are dying because of severe drought, but are not getting any kind of support. In Ecuador, they are demanding the rehabilitation of their lands and resources destroyed by oil spills. In Norway, the Sami people are opposing the windmill farms as this will severely affect their reindeer herding areas, which is part of their culture and livelihood. In the US, Native Americans are defending their lands, rivers, and resources from tar sand mining. In Siberia, Russia, indigenous peoples are raising their concern on the unsustainable nickel mining for electric cars of Tesla. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the indigenous peoples protecting their forest, which is declared as national park, are being evicted as they are regarded as destroyers of the forests. These are the realities of climate justice issues for indigenous peoples across the world. While indigenous peoples have the least carbon footprint due to our simple lifestyles, we are highly vulnerable to climate change. At the same time, while we are protecting and conserving forests and biodiversity, we are evicted in the name of conservation and carbon sequestration. We are even criminalized in practicing our livelihoods. Likewise, while indigenous peoples are fully supporting the just transition for fossil fuels to renewable energy, the implementation of many renewable energy projects are violating our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, to our livelihoods, to our cultures, and to our well-being. This is also the issue of social equity, as energy is not for indigenous communities, but for industries and the urban and semi-urban areas. Let me present an overview on indigenous peoples and why climate justice is at the heart of our survival. The indigenous peoples comprise 6.2% of the global population, but 15% of the poorest. 72% of the more than 476 million indigenous peoples live in rural areas, including in fragile ecosystems, which we have conserved and adapted to for centuries, but are now threatened by climate change. For centuries, indigenous peoples across the globe are living in harmony with nature for our collective survival and well-being and the survival of the future generations. Indigenous peoples continue to conserve more than 50% of the world's remaining biodiversity and enrich our cultural diversity as our contribution to the world. Majority of indigenous peoples persisted in maintaining our strong attachments to our customary lands and resources, which we regard as the source of our distinct identity, spirituality, traditional knowledge, culture, and ways of life. So we are one with our land. With this principle and practice, indigenous peoples maintain our interdependent and respectful relationship with nature and the environment. The land, the seas, rivers, mountains, forests, savannas, deserts, the sun, the moon, the sky, the wind, the flora and fauna. This relation is further expressed in our social values of cooperation, reciprocity, upholding the common good, do no harm, and to use resources for one's needs and not greed. These social values are important in maintaining community cohesion and resilience, as well as in maintaining peace and conserving resources for the future generations. These values are the foundation and framework of environmental sustainability for indigenous peoples.
Depending on who you ask, the crises of climate change and its concomitant others originates either with the Industrial Revolution in 1492 or, as Caroline pointed out, it's fake news. Andreas Malm has shown in his book how the emergence of fossil capital was, beginning with coal in Britain, largely determined by the desire for the superior control of subordinate labor. Following the Dalit scholar B.R. Ambedkar and his insightful analysis about caste, which is namely, caste is not just a division of labor, it is a division of laborers, one might add that climate politics is entangled increasingly and is also about the superior control of subordinate laborers, beginning with the first multinational extractivist corporations, as Ime showed in her keynote this morning, which is concomitant with the rise of the transatlantic enslavement and colonialism and settler colonialism as processes. Indeed, the global division of laborers is then one of the crucial deadly effects of what the oligarchy of the 1% in what Ramon Grossvogel, the decolonial scholar, has called the modern colonial capitalist patriarchal world system. And this is what it seeks to maintain. Race and racism, one might argue, was a creation of this project of the global division of laborers, among other things, as are necessarily the forms and sites where these racializations are materialized en masse. So for example, in camps, favelas, banlieues, refugee camps, prisons, and so on, and are concomitant with the creation of the plantation and transatlantic slavery, as well as the border regimes that seek to maintain these structures. Some might call this neo-colonialism. Following the scholarship related to the argument in Fossil Capital, it becomes clear that not only do capitalist logics of extraction require a global division of laborers, and therefore a global ordering and subjugation of the dispossessed, the landless, stateless, subjects, and non-citizens of modernity, but since we are also discussing climate justice and social movements, this also means that those protesting this division, standing up against it, or extraction or invasion of lands, as Joan showed earlier, in certain zones, have faced the pits of necropolitics and continue to be condemned to brutal repression. Global Witness reported that a record 212 environmental activists were killed in 2019. Half of the reported killing in 2019 took place in Colombia and the Philippines, with 64 and 43 deaths recorded respectively, with two-thirds of the deaths occurring in Latin America alone. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit Colombia earlier this year, Ernesto Guasiruma and his brother were quarantining at home, fearing rise of infections. They were shot dead in their own home for protecting their lands. Similarly, when Leon Dulce, the Filipino activist, was asked about the safety of himself and others, he says, safety is no longer in the vocabulary of environmental defenders or, activists in general in the Philippines. It is a situation where you will always fear for your life. But then if you're not going to do the work you do, who else will do it? The resilience, resistance, and ongoing struggles of the post-apocalyptic generations subjected to settler colonial and colonial regimes then on this day of mourning can serve as an anchor for envisioning common futures for the commons. The DARA and Climate Vulnerability Report reveals that climate change is responsible for 400,000 deaths annually, as a very conservative estimate. However, those numbers are counted, with that number jumping to 4.5 million when accounting for deaths associated with various aspects of a globalized, carbon-intensive, extractivist economy. Depending on how we count the victims of climate crises, this figure might be uncomfortably high, although one might ask if numbers of lives lost should be the point at which one becomes uncomfortable. What would kin-making mean for reparations, climate reparations, for how we do local politics in the global north, and what would it mean for our politics around borders, flows of capital, weapons manufacturing, and companies like Tesla, which mines lithium in Bolivia, and so on? What would one find if one followed these ethico-political emergencies, and what would the much-needed movements, which I greatly admire, around us seek to do? Fridays for whose futures, rebellion against whose extinction, and the end of which Gelände?
There is no single story, which seems obvious. Obviously there are many people and we all have our own experiences and perspectives, but discursive power is not distributed equally. So among other dimensions of discrimination, race, gender, and class determine whose framing will be perceived as neutral, objective, universal, and so on. And the framing of the root causes of the climate crisis gives an interesting example of contesting narratives. And as has been mentioned in the previous presentation already. In Western narratives, often we start with the industrialization and the use of coal around 1800. And on the other hand, many linked to the formerly colonized world point to the racist colonial violence that has been emanating from Europe since at least the beginning of the colonial project in the 15th century. And in fact, the Antarctic ice bores that you can see on the picture on the left-hand side link the beginning of the Anthropocene to colonialism. So around 1610, there was a rapid decrease of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. And this substantiates the theory that this rapid drop in CO2 is linked to the violent colonization of South America and the genocide of indigenous peoples. Within just a little more than 100 years after the arrival of the Portuguese in 1492, it is estimated that up to 90% of the indigenous population had died. And as a result, agriculture pretty much came to a standstill. Forests grew back and so much CO2 was sucked from the Earth's atmosphere that CO2 levels reached a low point, resulting in a small ice age. And you can see this drop in the graph at the bottom. So we see how these two narratives are different and obviously have different implications. One starting with coal in the UK in 1610 and the other starting with the destruction caused by the colonial project in South America in 1492. And of course, this would also result in very different understandings of climate justice and lead us to different conclusions on what justice would require. So this brings me to the second point. Statistics from the US are usually aggregated by race and show again and again very clearly that Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color are much more likely to live in inner city heatlands and suffer from heat waves, or to live within the floodlines, as was previously pointed out, and be affected by floods, or live within the proximity of polluting industries. And while this kind of data is not available in most other countries, because it's not aggregated in that way, we can also see a similar correlation between race and exposition to environmental pollution and noise pollution, or sorts of harmful pollutions in Germany when we look at the distribution of pollution linked to race, basically. So we see that in Berlin also, racialized people live in areas and in streets and on intersections that are more heavily polluted. And while there are numerous reports by the UN, the IPCC, the WHO, OECD, and so on and so forth, on the intersection of gender and climate change, and also on the intersection of poverty and climate change, I'm not aware of a single report that focuses on the intersection of race and climate change. So this erasure of race as a crucial dimension of oppression will exacerbate the impact climate change will have on racialized people. Reports on the intersection of climate change and gender are very clear, that measures that are designed for all do not work for all and do not reach all. Often benefits, the benefits only often reach those at the center, and to thus further marginalize those already at the margins. It's only when we think we're the most vulnerable, the most dispossessed, the most sidelined in mind that we can identify solutions that truly benefit all. Yesterday, we heard a lot about renewable energy and decarbonization pathways, but we must not forget that this transition in the global north threatens to create new geographies of extraction, exploitation, and violence. How we constitute climate justice, how we think of climate justice, the stories and narratives that we create around climate justice will determine whether people can keep their rights to their territories, to their lands, to their health, livelihoods, culture, well-being, and so on. So next slide. What does this mean for climate justice in practice? And how do we build a climate justice movement across different positionings? And I would kind of follow the previous presentation in asking just crucial questions, really, by starting to ask who benefits from certain measures, who pays the costs, and who is part of the decision-making processes, and who decides at the end of the day. And I would like to end here with these questions, and thank you very much for your attention. I hope it became clear why we must include racial justice in our fights for climate justice. Thank you.
This topic of climate change is obviously fundamental to islands around the world in many, many ways. But sometimes it kind of is seen as the issue that eclipses everything else. And so what I've seen as an observer in different places, particularly in the Pacific Island, climate change becomes the issue. And the reality is that people living on the islands in the Pacific are not thinking about climate change 24 hours a day. They're thinking about energy, education, they're thinking about healthcare, they're thinking about all the other things that everyone is thinking about in their day-to-day lives. So there is an important balance there. The impact that that does have is islands that are very dependent on outside funding are forced to focus everything on climate change because that is what funders want. And so you see situations in the Pacific where, say, a school project is framed around climate change because that's what the donors want to invest money in, whereas there is a need for schools, hospitals, all these other basic services. So that's obviously not to discount the importance of climate change, but maybe just to pose that as a a point that has been made to me, and I think is an important one to consider.
There is really a need to mainstream it, meaning to approach climate change from one area of climate change only versus approaching it from a whole of government. So what does climate change, what do we have to do to reflect our public services? It includes education, including health, including how we deliver even governance because of the climate change potential issues to the way we govern. So by mainstreaming it, at least in our case, for example, we have islets of our own. So we have 4 island villages. So how do you deliver public services if you only have 1 doctor in the whole island? So you have to start capacitating your island communities, installing telemed services, because that's the only way that they can contact your doctor without the risk of, storms or storm surges that's gonna hit you, or the waves that's gonna hit you. And the way, how do you deliver education? So you start thinking about technology. You do TV-based learnings, you use Facebook. So you have to start innovating because climate change is really there. It's real. It's not being packaged because the donors want it. It's because you have to mainstream it. And if you mainstream it, and the governance is also mainstream, then you have a more adaptable solution that can last for the next 30 years when the climate will really, really change.
A lot more work needs to be done on the islands in terms of the narrative as to what we want to see for our more sustainable future, whether or not it's blue, green, orange, or anything else. And how do we go around, deal with that better? I think is sharing our stories. We need to really be more vocal, whether or not we are attending networks such as the Island Innovation Network, joining networks such as this so we can amplify our voices. I mentioned this before. It's very important to tell the stories of what we want to see, and don't be afraid to document them as well, whether or not you're going to blog about them, or are you going to write papers. There's nothing stopping us from that. And I think in sustainable development, what's often missing as well is that element of grassroots governance, right? So a lot of high level things are happening, and leadership and movements in policy, but we haven't fully engaged the grassroots, which the work is there to benefit. How can we benefit a community of people from whether or not it's from renewable energy or tourism or science and research? How can we do that without fully engaging them and understanding what it is that they would want? And so the message I want to share there is don't be afraid to tell your stories.
We have a real crisis here. It isn't the fact that 30 years is coming and the city will be underwater, but the fact that no one is acting like it's going to happen in 30 years. And it's not going to be 30 years and then surprise, it's incremental. That's what's going to happen. And through workshops and conferences and talks, you try to convince different sectors of the gravity of the situation. We are talking about 30 years. If you're old enough to remember the reunification of Germany, and until now, that's the time span we're talking about. And I think why the lack of alarm could be summed up by Jeff Goodall in his book, The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities and the Remaking of the Civilized World, where he says we are not wired to make decisions about barely perceptible threats that gradually accelerate over time. We're not so different from the proverbial frog that boils to death in a pot of slowly warming water. And I think that really captures the philosophical problem that we are faced today. So there is a need, amongst other factors, other measures, for a mobilizing narrative. a big grand story that can be inclusive of different people in the civic sphere. We're talking about a mobilizing narrative that has a vision for sustainability. The author N. Yernak speaks of a mobilizing narrative as an unfolding story with a potential to serve as a theoretical thinking tool, an empirical guide to promote practical action. The narrative must include direction towards sustainability, distribution, global inclusiveness, and diversity, multiple approaches, methods, and solutions. It must also support arenas for dialogues and practices while aiming to replace deep divisions and distorting understandings that come about with people who reject climate change. The problem with forming narratives has a lot to do with the fact that climate change is not part of our history, not just Egypt, but globally. We can unify around poverty because we relate to that, and there's a global history of poverty, but there isn't a global history of climate change. Yes, individually, individual cases for sure, but not say on a global unified scale. The other problem is that people's poverty and immediate needs are always thought of first, and this is understandable in countries like Egypt, as well as we have the problem of civil society being constrained, as you might know, here in Egypt. So there is a lot of room for movement. The other major crisis is mutant capitalism that has no vision. It has no, end or and another obstacle in its way. And another factor is the lack of ideological pluralism. But building a civic narrative can work if we take into ingredients. For example, for Alexandria, what gives me hope is that the Alexandrian fishermen, with their limited education, have much more of a consciousness of climate change than Ivy League Republican senators in DC. There is also a history, like the first, there's a modest history of dealing with climate change, where in 1830, the ruler Muhammad Ali built the first wall against the sea, the first kind of in the world, and now that's being undermined. The other question is, we could think of civic narratives from the past and how we can revive that. Do we bring cosmopolitanism back and give it a much more 21st century feel to bring people into the story? Do we bring back Mubarak's universalism? For all of the problems of Mubarak, the Mubarak regime, he had an idea of tying Alexandria to the rest of the world. The other question is, do we look at the sociology of climate change, where we identify social structures and dimensions of agency that will facilitate transitional pathways to a low carbon society, but overall to fighting climate change as an existential question? What about social values relating to nature, the environment, and the climate? What does religion have to say? Given that religion, the mosque and the church plays a big part in Egypt, can we get the mosque and church on board? And there's a huge, there's lots of evidence to show that through the Quran and the Bible, that you can bring ideas of that support sustainability and protection of the environment. I'm just surprised it's not done to the level that it should be done. And so this is a question that we need to ask ourselves. And finally, I'll conclude when the CNN journalist was interviewing me in Alexandria about, he asked me, it was about the history and culture of Alexandria, and he asked me if my daughter was to come in 20 or 30 years' time, what can she expect? And we're not even talking about climate change. He says, what can my daughter expect? And I said to her, she's welcome to visit the world's biggest underwater museum if things don't happen and action is not taken. And thank you.
We have a lot of indigenous people in the whole Brazil, and they're in this frontier too, this bordering, people dying because gold miners are entering in the communities. So this is the voices come from the Amazonia. The voices come from Brazil. This is one of the problem have here. demarcation, them land we don't have here too. We have a big fight with the government. They want to open the indigenous territory to miner illegal. But we stay more strong. When you talk about Amazonia, defend the Amazonia is defend our Mother Earth. The relation what we have with Amazonia, with the earth, with the land, is like our mother. The relation we have with our river or plants is more than land. It's our life. We are together. We are together. We are connected. It's this message I want to share with yours. We are connected. Like, and this my place. What happened in this actual situation? This year, June to September month, we have a big area in the Amazonia, Pantanal was burning. And November month now we are feeling here in the north part. Here in Roraima, my place, last year we have working together with network with Repan. Repan is network Rede Pan-Amazônia, and other institute we have training pollinators course on climate change, inviting them people from traditional community here at the university, diversity realities, and training them to go to them to work on them bases. What's happened with them? What happened with the climate? Peoples of the far of the cities, them don't know what's happened. The time of the fish to plant, it's very different. How them big cities are affecting the small population who live far places. So we started doing this course, training them people from the bus to go to work and to share this information. What is happening with our land?